My aunt told me the jewelry had been sold to cover estate debts. She said it at the kitchen table of her own house 6 weeks after my grandmother died, with a cup of tea in front of her, and the specific expression of a woman delivering an unfortunate fact she had nothing to do with creating. She said the debts had been larger than expected, and that the estate had been insufficient to honor all of the bequests, and that the ring and the pearl bracelet and the small diamond pendant that my grandmother had specifically named to me in her will had been sold at an estate sale to cover the shortfall. She said she was sorry. She said it in the practiced way of a person who has said something enough times that the saying of it no longer costs her anything. I said I understand. I drove home. I was 29 years old and I had just lost my grandmother, and I believed my aunt because she was the executor, and because executors know things about estates that beneficiaries do not, and because I did not have any particular reason at that moment to disbelieve her. What changed was a conversation at a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years later with a woman named Patricia who had been my aunt's neighbor for 11 years, and who mentioned, in the casual way that people mention things they do not know are significant, that she had done the pricing and display work for my grandmother's estate sale. Patricia said she remembered the jewelry particularly because one of the pieces, a ring with a large center stone, had been a very strong seller. She said she had priced it at the consignment rate and it had sold within the first hour to a buyer who she believed was a dealer. She said she thought it had gone for around $3,000. She paused and said, "I hope that helped the estate." I said yes. I said thank you. I went to find a bathroom and stood in it for approximately 5 minutes doing arithmetic. Before I go on, if this story connects with something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Vera. I am 32 years old. And this is the story of how an estate sale professional named Patricia, a probate court filing that my aunt had been hoping I would never request, and an accountant named Dennis who had worked with estate records for 27 years gave me back what my grandmother had left me and exposed 2 years of false filings. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not the kitchen table conversation, before that. To the house in Worthington, Ohio, where my grandmother Eleanor had lived for 41 years and where she had, over the course of my childhood and young adulthood, become the most consistent presence in my life in the particular way that grandmothers sometimes are, which is to say that she was not managing a job and a marriage and other children simultaneously when she was with me. And so the quality of her attention was different, less divided, more complete. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 84 when she died. She had been a bookkeeper for 30 years, and before that a secretary, and before that a young woman in Cincinnati who had married my grandfather Arthur at 22 and had then, after his death in 1988, run her own household with the specific competence of someone who has always understood numbers and has never been afraid of them. She was a small, precise woman with strong opinions about grammar and about the correct way to address envelopes and about what constituted genuine kindness as distinct from the performance of it. She smelled like a specific hand cream that came in a green tube that I have never found in any other form, and that when I occasionally encounter something similar in a store, I stop and stand very still for a moment before moving on. She loved me with the particular directness of a woman who does not require an occasion to say so. My Aunt Roberta is my mother's older sister. She is 61 now. She and my grandmother had a relationship that I understood as a child to be complex, and that I understand now more specifically as one in which my grandmother had been a resource for Roberta's needs for a long time without the relationship being notably reciprocal. Roberta had borrowed money that had not been fully repaid. She had lived in my grandmother's house for a period in her 40s during a divorce. She had received help with her own children's school expenses at various points. None of these things were secrets. My grandmother did them willingly and without apparent resentment, and I do not think she considered them debts. She considered them family. My mother, my grandmother's younger daughter, died when I was 17 in a car accident that was not her fault, and that reorganized my understanding of what the world would allow to happen suddenly and without warning. After my mother died, my grandmother became more central in my life, more present, more specifically mine. She called every Sunday without exception. She came to my college graduation. She sent specific cards for specific occasions with actual messages inside them. She told me once, when I was about 23 and was having a very difficult year, that the particular quality of my laugh was her favorite sound and that she wanted me to use it as often as possible as a personal favor to her. I thought about that sentence on the day she died, and I have thought about it many times since. The will was not a surprise. My grandmother had told me about it directly 3 years before she died, at the same kitchen table where Roberta would later tell me the jewelry had been sold. She said Roberta will be executor because she is local and because she is capable and because I want you to trust that I have made my wishes clear in the document and they will be carried out. She named the ring. She named the pearl bracelet that had been her own mother's. She named the diamond pendant that my grandfather had given her on their 25th anniversary. She said these are yours when I am gone because they should belong to someone who knows what they meant. She also named a cash bequest of $15,000, which she said was from a savings account she had been building specifically for me and that she had set aside years before, and that was for whatever you need it for most when the time comes. I said I did not want to talk about this. She said, I know you don't. She said, we are talking about it anyway because I want you to know what I have arranged so that you do not have to wonder. She died in April. I was with her at the end, and I held her hand the way you hold someone's hand when you understand it is the last time, and you want to be completely present for it, and you do not know if you are succeeding at being present or only at the appearance of being present. She was gone before the light changed. I drove home in the specific way that you drive when something has just happened that will never be undated. Roberta handled the estate. She sent me paperwork. She sent death certificates to the relevant institutions. She filed with the probate court. I received a notice that the estate had been opened and that Roberta had been confirmed as executor and that as a named beneficiary, I would be informed of distributions when they were made. I waited. I sent Roberta a card. I called once to ask if there was anything I could do. She said no. She said it was all straightforward and she had it under control. I said thank you. I went back to my life, which at that point was an apartment in Columbus and a job in marketing at a healthcare company, and the specific grief of a person who has lost the last reliable anchor in their family. The kitchen table conversation was 6 weeks later. The ring sold to cover debts. The pearl bracelet sold. The pendant sold. The cash bequest, she said, had been partially honored. She said she had been able to distribute $7,000 of the $15,000 I had been left, and that the remaining $8,000 had gone to estate expenses, including the sale itself and the attorney fees and outstanding bills. She slid an envelope across the table with a check for $7,000 inside it. I thanked her. I left. 2 years passed. The $7,000 sat in a savings account that I had mentally labeled Grandma's money and touched as little as possible because I had not fully resolved what to do with it, and because not spending it felt like the right response to something I did not yet understand. I thought about the jewelry occasionally with a specific ache that I had nowhere to place. The ring in particular. My grandmother had worn it every day that I remembered. It had a specific warmth from her hand that I associated with her in the way that sensory details become associated with people you love, inseparably, permanently. Thanksgiving. My aunt's dining room. Patricia, who had been her neighbor for 11 years and who helped with occasional estate and consignment work, mentioned the estate sale. $3,000 for the ring. A dealer buyer in the first hour. I drove home and I sat at my kitchen. I want to tell you what the 90 minutes at my kitchen table actually looked like. I had opened the probate court portal expecting to find either nothing useful or a confirmation that Roberta had filed everything correctly and that the story I had been told was the correct one. What I found instead was a complete set of documents that were publicly filed and publicly accessible, and that described the administration of my grandmother's estate in specific numerical detail. I pulled up the inventory first. It listed the contents of the estate with estimated values, the furniture, the car, the accounts, and the jewelry, 4 items described and valued at a combined estimate of $4,000. I looked at that estimate. My grandmother had owned the ring for 35 years. The pearl bracelet had belonged to her mother before her. $4,000 for 4 items that included a ring with a center stone that I could not imagine being worth less than $1,000 by itself. I wrote the figure down and circled it and moved to the accounting. The accounting took me longer. It is a specific kind of document that is not designed for readability, and that requires you to hold several figures in your head simultaneously to understand how they relate to each other. I read it once for orientation and then a second time more slowly and then a third time with a pencil in my hand. When I had finished the third reading, I had 4 numbers circled in large circles on my yellow legal pad, and 2 of them did not match what Patricia had told me at Thanksgiving, and one of them said miscellaneous expenses $3,900 with no further detail, and the last one said distribution to beneficiary $7,000. Which was the check I had received 2 years before across a kitchen table with a cup of tea and the word insufficient in an expression that I now understood differently than I had understood it at the time. The ledger was there. I had not read it. Table with my laptop and I opened the probate court's online search portal. In Ohio, the probate court maintains public records of estate filings and many of them are searchable and accessible online. I searched my grandmother's name, the estate of Eleanor Marsh. There was a filing. There was an inventory. There was an accounting. I read the accounting for 90 minutes. I read it 3 times in different orders, and I took notes on a yellow legal pad, and I circled numbers, and I drew lines between entries, and at the end of 90 minutes, I had the following understanding. The estate inventory had listed the jewelry at a combined estimated value of $4,000. The accounting showed it had been sold at estate sale for a total of $3,100, which was less than the inventory value, which is how it was framed as an insufficient return. The accounting showed estate sale proceeds of $11,200 total. The accounting showed attorney fees of $4,600 and estate sale company fees of $2,800 and miscellaneous expenses of $3,900. The accounting showed the cash bequest to me of $15,000 had been reduced to $7,000 because of insufficient assets. The accounting showed a distribution to Roberta, as executor, of a fee of $3,500, which is within the statutory range for Ohio executors, and which I had not known about, and which my grandmother had not mentioned when she told me about the will, because executor fees had presumably not been part of her understanding of the arrangement at the time. I called Patricia that Sunday. I said I want to ask you about the estate. I also want to tell you about the specific quality of calling Patricia the Sunday after Thanksgiving. I had thought about it carefully before I called. I did not want to say more than I knew or to imply something I could not yet support. I said I was doing some research on the estate and I had a question about the sale. She said, of course. She said she remembered it well because it had been a good sale overall and the jewelry had been a particular highlight. I said, can you tell me what the 3 pieces sold for? She said she thought so. She had records somewhere. She gave me the figures from memory first. The ring around $3,000, the bracelet around $1,800, the pendant around $1,200, and then she said, let me confirm these from the actual records, and she went to find them while I stayed on the phone. I could hear her moving through what sounded like a file drawer, and then the sound of papers, and then she came back and said, okay, I have them. She read out the exact figures. $3,040. $1,850, $1,160, total of $6,050. She said, I keep records of every sale I work because clients sometimes have questions later, and I want to be able to answer them accurately. She said it as a statement of professional practice, simply, without understanding in that moment what she had just given me. I thanked her and said I would be in touch if I had any more questions. I hung up. I looked at the numbers on my legal pad. $3,040 and $1,850 and $1,160. Total $6,050. The estate accounting said total jewelry proceeds of $3,100. The difference between those 2 numbers was $2,950. The difference between those 2 numbers had a name, and the name was not clerical error talk sale. She said, sure, of course. I said, you mentioned the ring sold for around $3,000. She said, yes, that's right, maybe a little more. The buyer negotiated, but it was in that range. I said, what about the other pieces, the pearl bracelet and the small pendant? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said they both sold too. She said the bracelet sold for around $1,800. The pendant she thought was around $1,200. I said so, the 3 pieces together. She did some thinking out loud. She said probably $6,000, maybe a little more. I said the estate sale accounting shows the combined jewelry sale at $3,100. Patricia said that is not right. She said I have the records somewhere. I kept copies because that's my practice. She said let me find them. She found them. She emailed them to me on a Tuesday morning. The estate sale records showed the ring at $3,040. the pearl bracelet at $1,850, the pendant at $1,160, total jewelry proceeds of $6,050. The estate sale accounting filed with the probate court showed total jewelry proceeds of $3,100. The difference was $2,950, the difference between what had sold and what had been reported. I called an estate attorney named I want to tell you about the specific quality of sitting at my kitchen table on the Sunday evening before I called Dennis. I had spent the afternoon with the documents, the portal records, and the numbers I had written down, and the figures from Patricia and the comparison I had made between them. I had done the arithmetic enough times to be very certain that I had done it correctly. $6,050 in jewelry proceeds documented by the sale records, $3,100 in the filed accounting. The difference was not a rounding error. The difference was $2,950, and it did not have an innocent explanation that I could construct. I sat with that for a while. I made dinner. I ate it. I sat back down. I thought about what it means to know something that you would rather not know about a person you have known your whole life. Not a stranger. Not an adversary. Someone who attended my mother's funeral and who used to come to Christmas and who sat at my grandmother's table across from me on the afternoons we were both there at the same time. I thought about whether there was a version of this that had an innocent explanation, and the honest answer was that I could not construct one that held together under examination. $6,050 in, $3,100 reported. That gap does not close with an innocent explanation. I called Dennis Park the next morning at 9 o'clock. He answered on the second ring. I said, I have a situation I need you to look at. He said, come in at 2 this afternoon. I said, I will be there. I put my legal pad in my bag, and I took the documents from my printer, and I put those in the bag too. And the next morning, I drove to Dennis's office on the 4th floor, and I set everything on his desk, and I said, I think the filed accounting does not match the sale records. He said, let me see. He looked for 12 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said, tell me about the woman who worked the sale. I said, her name is Patricia, and she has records. He said, then let's get Patricia's records. I said, she has already offered to send them. He said, excellent. He said, this is a case. I said, I know. He said, I am glad you came in. Dennis Park, whose office was in Columbus and who had been recommended to me by a colleague. Dennis had 27 years of experience with estate and probate work. I explained the situation and sent him the documents by email while we were still on the phone. He was quiet for a long time while he reviewed them. Then he said, I need you to sit down. I said, I am sitting. He said the variance between the actual sale records and the filed accounting is not a clerical error. He said the inventory value discrepancy and the accounting discrepancy are consistent with what he would describe as a systematic underreporting of estate assets. He said, I want to look at the miscellaneous expenses line. He said $3,900 in miscellaneous expenses on an estate this size is significant. He said, I am going to request the supporting documentation for that line item. He filed a petition with the probate court requesting a full accounting with documentation for every expense line. He submitted Patricia's records as an exhibit. He submitted a comparison analysis he had prepared showing the discrepancy between the filed accounting and the actual sale records. He notified the court that the estate had potentially been administered with inaccurate filings. The court notified Roberta. Roberta called me 2 days after receiving the court notice. She said she could not believe I had done this. She said she had done everything correctly and that there had been clerical errors in the records that would be easy to explain. I said, Roberta, the estate sale company has records that show $6,000 in jewelry proceeds. The estate filing shows $3,100. I said those records are dated and signed and come from the company that ran the sale. She said there were costs that were deducted at the sale level. I said, Dennis will look at any documentation you have. She said, I do not appreciate this. I said, I know. I said, I am sorry that you feel that way. I said, I also need the accounting to be accurate. Roberta submitted supplemental documentation to the court over the following 3 weeks. The supplemental materials included receipts for the miscellaneous expenses that Dennis reviewed carefully. He said approximately $1,800 of the miscellaneous expenses were legitimate, documented, and appropriate. He said approximately $2,100 consisted of 2 receipts that he described as questionable, one for a cleaning service on a date after the house had already been vacated, and one for a storage unit rental that did not correspond to any inventory item in the estate. The jewelry discrepancy remained unexplained. The supplemental documentation did not address it. Dennis filed a formal objection to the accounting on behalf of my interests as a beneficiary. He itemized the discrepancies and calculated a corrected accounting. He said under the corrected figures, the estate had sufficient assets to fully honor my bequest of $15,000. He said the shortfall that Roberta had presented to me as the reason I received only $7,000 had been based on figures that did not match the documentary record. A hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March at the probate court in Franklin County. The judge was a woman named Helen Ayers who had the bearing of a probate judge, which is to say someone who has seen a great deal of family money and family behavior and has developed a very clear and practiced sense of what constitutes a legitimate accounting and what does not. She reviewed Dennis's filing. She reviewed Roberta's responses. She reviewed Patricia's records. She asked Roberta's attorney several specific questions about the jewelry discrepancy and about the 2 receipts Dennis had flagged. Roberta's attorney gave answers that Dennis described afterward as not responsive to the questions asked, which in legal terms is a specific kind of answer that a judge notices. Judge Ayers did not rule from the bench that morning. She took the matter under consideration and issued a written ruling 12 days later. She found that the accounting as filed was materially inaccurate in 3 specific respects. She found that the jewelry proceeds had been underreported by $2,950. She found that 2 expense items totaling $2,100 were unsupported by credible documentation. She found that the executor had therefore distributed assets inconsistent with the terms of the estate. She ordered a corrected distribution to me of $8,050, which represented the balance of my original bequest adjusted for legitimate estate costs, plus interest for the 2-year period since the original incorrect distribution. She referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review. I received the check on a Wednesday in April. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the bank where I had deposited it, and I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table telling me the ring and the bracelet and the pendant were mine because they should belong to someone who knows what they meant. I thought about Patricia at a Thanksgiving dinner, saying the ring was a very strong seller, sold in the first hour. She thought around $3,000. I thought about a woman who kept her estate sale records as a professional practice and who emailed them to me on a Tuesday morning without knowing she was doing anything other than answering a question about a sale she had helped with 2 years before. I thought about the probate court's online search portal that I had sat down at on a Sunday evening with a yellow legal pad and found 90 minutes later. Roberta and I have not spoken since the hearing. I have not tried to call her. I do not know what I would say. I know what happened, and I know that she knows what happened, and I know that neither of us is unclear on the facts. Whether there is ever a version of us that exists on the other side of the facts is a question I am not ready to answer yet. I hold it the way you hold questions that require more time than you currently have. The jewelry is gone. The ring and I want to say something about losing the jewelry itself that I have not said yet because I think it is important to say it plainly. The money is not the thing I was most upset about losing. I know that sounds strange given that I spent 14 months in a legal process to recover it. What I mean is that the money was the provable part. The money was the part that a court could address. The ring and the bracelet and the pendant were the part that could not be addressed in the same way because they were gone, and no court order brings back a ring that was sold to a dealer in the first hour of an estate sale 2.5 years ago. My grandmother wore that ring every day of my life until she could no longer. It was present in every memory I have of her hands, which are the hands that reached for mine and the hands that made things in the kitchen and the hands that wrote in the notebooks I found after. The ring was on those hands and is not anymore and is in a case somewhere in a city I do not know and will stay there. I have made my peace with this the way you make peace with permanent things, not all at once, not completely, in the recurring way that permanent losses require. I accept it, and then I accept it again on days when the accepting does not hold. What the legal process gave me was not the jewelry. It was the acknowledgement that what had been taken was real, that my grandmother's intentions were real, that the document she had signed meant what it said, and that a judge in a courtroom had read it and confirmed that it meant what it said. That confirmation matters to me separately from the money. The ring is not coming back. But the record says correctly that it was mine, and that is not nothing. That is not a small thing. Bracelet and the pendant were sold at a table in my grandmother's driveway 2 years before I had the accounting that told me I should have them. They are in someone else's collection now, and I will not get them back. This is the one part of the story that does not resolve cleanly. The money resolves. The accounting resolves. The court record resolves. The ring does not come back. I understand this, and I have made a kind of peace with it, and then some days I make the peace again because it requires remaking. That is the shape of some losses. Not the loss itself, but the requirement to keep choosing to accept it. What I do have is the check from my grandmother's savings account, the one she set aside specifically and called the money for whatever you need it for most when the time comes. It came to me in 2 installments across 2 years, and it is sitting in a savings account in full now, and I look at it on the days when I need to remember that she made a decision about me before I needed anything from it, and that the decision survived the 2 years it was being withheld and arrived correctly in the end. I have been deciding what to use it for. She said use it for whatever you need most when the time comes. I think the time is coming. I think I am getting close to knowing what the most is. I want to say something before I go, not about Roberta. Not about the hearing or the referral to the prosecutor. About Patricia. About the woman who spent 11 years as my aunt's neighbor, and who helped run an estate sale for a woman she did not know, and who kept her records the way professional people keep records, carefully and indefinitely, in a folder somewhere. Because that is the practice of someone who has learned that records requested 2 years after the fact are just as important as records requested the same day. She did not know her records would matter. She did not know she was keeping evidence. She was keeping records. She emailed them on a Tuesday morning because I called and asked, and she said, sure, of course, let me find them. That is all it took. A person who kept records finding them when asked and sending them because that is what you do when someone asks. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose stepbrother had been filing false tax documents using her identity for 3 years and what the IRS letter in her mailbox started, that story is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And if someone hands you a check and tells you the assets were insufficient, ask to see the sale records before you say thank you. I want to tell you about Worthington because the place has a specific quality that is part of why this story feels the way it feels. It is a suburb north of Columbus that has the particular character of a place where people stay for a long time. Tree-lined streets with older houses that have been maintained across generations. A small downtown that has not entirely been replaced by chain stores and that still has the texture of a place with its own specific identity. My grandmother had lived in the same house on Lawton Avenue for 41 years, and the house had acquired the particular quality of long habitation, the way things settle into place when they have been in place for decades, furniture that occupies the exact position it has always occupied, light that enters the same windows at the same angles every morning, the smell of a place that is entirely specific to that place and not duplicatable anywhere else. The garden in her backyard was smaller than it had been when she had the energy to maintain a larger one, but she had kept the part she could keep, and it had the specific quality of a well-tended small thing, tidy and intentional. She grew herbs and a row of dahlias and 2 rose bushes that had been there since the 1990s and that were older than some of the people who had come to see her in the last years. I used to sit in the garden with her on summer afternoons when I visited, and she would tell me about the dahlias, which varieties she had learned produced reliably and which required more attention than they were worth. She had very specific opinions about plants the same way she had very specific opinions about everything. Not harsh opinions, precise ones. She told me once that a dahlia will show you within 2 seasons whether it intends to cooperate, and that if it does not cooperate in 2 seasons, you should stop asking it to and plant something that will. I have thought about this advice in contexts well beyond dahlias. My mother's death when I was 17 changed the architecture of my family in ways that took me years to fully map. Before it, I had a mother and a grandmother and an aunt and a set of extended connections that functioned like a family is supposed to function, imperfectly and with friction, but with an underlying solidity that I had not thought to notice until it was partially gone. After it, I had a grandmother and an aunt and a differently shaped set of connections that required more maintenance to hold their form. My grandmother became the person I called when I needed to be reminded that someone was specifically glad I existed. She was good at this. She did not perform it. She said it plainly in the specific voice of a woman who has had enough life to know that what matters is what you say clearly rather than what you leave unstated in the hope that the other person already knows. Roberta had been executor of the estate because she was local, which was geographically practical, and because she was capable in the organizational sense, which was true. She had managed her own complicated financial life with apparent competence for several decades. My grandmother had told me she had chosen her because she was capable and because Roberta lived 40 minutes away and I lived in Columbus, which was the same distance, but in the other direction. She said this in the way she explained decisions that had practical logic to them and that she had made with her eyes open. She did not say she trusted Roberta implicitly. She said she was capable and local. I did not, at 26 when she told me this, parse the difference between capable and trusted as carefully as I perhaps should have. The period of the estate administration was one of the stranger periods of my life. Grief is strange at the administrative level. The specific combination of the emotional weight of losing someone and the bureaucratic requirements of the loss, the calls to insurance companies, the paperwork, the practical reality of possessions and accounts, and outstanding bills. I was not the executor, and so most of the administration was not mine to do. And in some ways that was a relief, and in other ways it was difficult because it meant I had limited visibility into what was happening, and I was depending on Roberta's updates, which were brief and infrequent, and which conveyed, looking back, only what she wanted me to know. I tried to stay out of her way. I understood, or thought I understood, that managing an estate is time-consuming and complicated, and that an executor dealing with a beneficiary who asks constant questions is an additional burden. I asked 2 questions in the 4 months between my grandmother's death and the kitchen table conversation. I asked once whether there was anything I could do to help. She said no. I asked once whether there was a timeline for when things would be resolved. She said she was hoping to have the estate closed within 4 to 5 months. These were not unreasonable things to say to someone who was asking minimally polite questions and expecting answers in the same register. The answers satisfied me because I was not looking for something wrong, and because everything I have thought a great deal since this resolved about Roberta as a person, and about what I believe happened inside her thinking when she made the choices she made. I do not think she set out to steal from me in the planned, deliberate way that word usually implies. I think she had been in a relationship with my grandmother in which money moved in one direction for a long time, and in which my grandmother had, with genuine love, subsidized things for Roberta that Roberta had not entirely earned. I think she understood herself to be owed something that the will did not adequately account for. I think she looked at an estate she was in charge of, and at a niece who was 2 hours away and grieving and who had a much shorter history with my grandmother in the visible local sense, and she decided that a correction was available to her, and she made it. I do not know whether she thought about it as a single decision or whether it accumulated from smaller decisions, the inventory estimate that was conservative, the accounting that used rounded figures, the expense receipts that addressed a shortfall. I do not know whether she believed I would not notice or whether she believed I would not know how to respond if I did. What I know is that she handed me a check for $7,000 with the word insufficient and watched me say I understand and leave. And for 2 years, that was the end of the story, and she was living in the end of it, and I was living in the end of it, and the end was different from what actually happened. The end changed, because Patricia worked an estate sale and kept records and mentioned the ring at a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years later. That is how the end changed. A woman who kept records mentioning the ring. What I want to say to anyone watching who has accepted the word insufficient from an executor is this. The word may be accurate. Estates do sometimes have more debts than assets, and bequests do sometimes have to be reduced. The word may also not be accurate. You have the right to request the accounting. You have the right to examine it. You have the right to compare the figures to any information you have about the assets. The probate court is a public record. The executor has an obligation to file accurate documents and to honor the terms of the will. If you believe the accounting is not accurate, you can hire an attorney who handles estate work, and you can ask them to look at it and tell you what they see. That is the process, and the process is available to you. You do not have to accept the word insufficient as a final answer. You are allowed to check the ledger. Felt plausible at a surface level, and because grief makes you tired in a way that does not produce the energy for detailed investigation of things you believe are being handled. The Thanksgiving when Patricia mentioned the estate sale was the second Thanksgiving after my grandmother's death. I had gone to Roberta's because my grandmother had always hosted Thanksgiving, and it was the first time in my life I could not go to my grandmother's house for Thanksgiving, and I did not want to be alone with that fact. So I went to Roberta's instead, which was the next closest thing geographically, if not emotionally. Patricia had come for dessert, a neighbor who had been invited in the way that neighbors who live close enough to be in earshot of a dinner party sometimes are. She was warm and practical, and had the slightly distracted quality of someone who is comfortable in most rooms, because she has been in enough of them to have run out of anxiety about it. She mentioned the estate sale the way people mention professional work they have done, as a point of reference rather than a specific revelation. I hope it helped the estate. $3,000 for the ring. I hope it helped the estate. I stood in Roberta's bathroom doing the arithmetic, and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table and the check for $7,000 and the word insufficient. Insufficient. I had accepted the word because it was the kind of word that sounds like it belongs to a category of facts that are simply true, like weather, like gravity. The estate was insufficient. These things happen. I accepted it, and I thanked her, and I left. I held the word insufficient for 2 years without examining it, and on the night of the Thanksgiving dinner, I began examining it, and I did not stop until I had examined it completely. Dennis Park had an office on the 4th floor of a building near the courthouse in Columbus that had the particular institutional quality of estate and probate law, a waiting room with chairs that had been there a long time, and a receptionist who understood that the people arriving were almost always in some state of grief or anger or both, and who treated everyone with a specific steady courtesy that was not warm exactly, but was consistent in a way that I found more useful than warmth would have been. Dennis himself was a compact man in his early 60s who had been doing this work for 27 years and who had developed the specific quality of someone who has seen the full range of what families do with inherited assets and has retained the capacity to be precise about it without being visibly disgusted. He said to me in our first meeting, "I want you to understand that what you are describing, if the documents support it, is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice." I said, "I understand." He said, "Good." He said, "Then let us see what the documents say." What the documents said was what I had found in 90 minutes on a Sunday evening at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and more. Dennis found things I had not found because he knew what to look for and where to look for it, and because 27 years of this work means you know the specific places in an estate filing where the numbers can be made to say things that require looking beneath the surface to correct. The executor fee was within the statutory range but at the high end given the size of the estate. The attorney fees were higher than Dennis would have expected for an estate this uncomplicated. The miscellaneous expenses line, the $3,900, was the one he kept returning to. He said in probate court filings that line is where things hide when they need to hide. He said we are going to need documentation for every dollar in that line, and the documentation is going to tell us what we need to know. The documentation told them what they needed to know. 2 receipts that Dennis described as questionable, a cleaning service on a date after the house had already been vacated and the locks changed, a storage unit rental with no corresponding inventory item. He said to me on the phone when he had reviewed them, "I have been doing this for 27 years. I know what a real receipt looks like, and I know what a receipt that has been produced to justify an expense looks like, and these 2 are the second kind." I said, "What does that mean for the case?" He said it means we file the objection and we let the judge decide. He said judges who do probate work have also seen both kinds. I want to describe the hearing in a way that goes beyond the legal summary I gave earlier. I arrived at the Franklin County Probate Court on a Thursday morning in March at 8:45. I had been to the courthouse once before to file a document Dennis had needed from me, and I remembered the specific smell of it, institutional and slightly old, and the quality of the light in the corridors, which was the kind of fluorescent light that makes everything look slightly more serious than it might otherwise appear. Dennis met me in the lobby. He was carrying his briefcase and a folder, and he was wearing a dark suit that conveyed professional seriousness without being theatrical about it. He said good morning. He asked how I had slept. I said adequately. He said, "That is usually enough." I had not seen Roberta since a brief phone call several months before. She was sitting at the respondent's table with her attorney when I entered the courtroom. She did not look at me when I came in, and I did not try to make her look at me. I sat beside Dennis at the petitioner's table, and I looked at the front of the room where Judge Ayers sat with the practiced stillness of a person who has waited out many difficult mornings in this exact chair, and who will wait out many more. She had a quality of precise attention that I found both reassuring and slightly unnerving, the attention of someone who will not let an answer stand if the answer did not actually address the question. Dennis presented for approximately 40 minutes. He was methodical and he was specific, and he did not use language that was more dramatic than the facts required. He presented Patricia's records. He presented the comparison between the filed accounting and the actual sale figures. He presented the miscellaneous expenses and the documentation Dennis had characterized as questionable. He walked through each line of the corrected accounting and showed what the estate would have looked like if the figures had been accurate. He said at the end, "My client's grandmother made very specific arrangements for her granddaughter's inheritance. The documents showed those arrangements were not honored in the distribution that was made. We are asking this court to correct the record and order the appropriate distribution." Roberta's attorney argued that records from estate sales could reflect different calculation methods, that consignment fees and seller costs could account for discrepancies, that my grandmother's estate had been administered in good faith with complex circumstances that had not been anticipated at the time of the will's execution. Judge Ayers asked 3 questions. She asked whether the estate sale company had charged any fees that would account for the difference between the sale records and the filed accounting. She asked for documentation of the cleaning service receipt. She asked whether the storage unit had contained any estate assets or had been used for a different purpose. Roberta's attorney's answers to all 3 questions were the answers of a person who does not have the documentation the questions require. The 12 days between the hearing and the ruling were among the stranger 12 days I have spent. I went to work. I did my job. I ate meals and slept and had conversations about ordinary things with the people in my ordinary life, and underneath all of it was the specific quality of a thing in process that I could not accelerate and could not stop and could only wait for. I called Dennis on the 8th day. He said he did not expect to be surprised by the ruling. I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I think the judge read what we put in front of her, and I think she will rule on what she read." I said, "Okay." He said, 12 days is not a long time when you are waiting for something. I said, "It is a medium-length time." He said, "Yes." He said, "Call me when you get the notification." I said, "I will." I got the notification on a Friday afternoon. I read it twice, and then I called Dennis, and he confirmed what I had read and said the wire would arrive within 10 business days. I thanked him. I sat at my desk at work for a moment doing nothing, and then I went back to what I had been doing because that is what you do. You go back to what you were doing, and the going back is itself a form of absorbing what has happened, not processing it completely, just carrying it alongside the other things that need carrying. I have been thinking a great deal since this resolved about what I want to do with what I know now, not about Roberta specifically, about systems. About the way estate administration works and the ways in which the structure that is supposed to protect beneficiaries can fail them if beneficiaries do not know how to use the tools available to them. The probate court's public records portal is not a secret. It is there and it is accessible, and the records in it are real, and they say things that matter. I did not know to look at it until I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening with the specific number from Patricia's dinner conversation running through my head. But the portal was there the whole time. The accounting my aunt had filed was a public document the entire time. If I had known to look at it 6 weeks after my grandmother died, when I was sitting across the kitchen table from Roberta receiving a check for $7,000 in the word insufficient, I would have looked at it that night. I am not saying I should have known. I am saying that the knowledge is available and I did not have it. I think about the specific population of people who receive incorrect estate distributions every year because they do not know that the accounting filed with the probate court is a public document. They can request and review and compare to their own knowledge of what the estate contained. I think about those people accepting the word insufficient the way I accepted it, not because they are naive, but because they are grieving and because the person delivering the word is in a position of apparent authority and because they do not know that a portal exists and that 30 minutes in it might tell them something different. This is not an accusation of any particular person. It is an observation about what people are not told about the systems that affect them when they are most vulnerable. One more thing about my grandmother. I want to say something about the specific experience of being a grieving person who discovers that they are also a wronged person. These two things are very different emotional states, and when they exist simultaneously, they do not simply add together. They create something more complicated. Grief wants you to be still and to accept loss as loss and to let time do what time does. Being wronged creates an energy that does not want to be still, and that requires action, and that has a direction. I discovered the discrepancy 2 years after my grandmother died. And at that point, I was no longer in the acute phase of grief, and the energy for action was available in a way it might not have been if I had found the numbers 6 weeks after her death. I think about this. I think about the version of this story where Patricia had mentioned the ring at the first Thanksgiving after my grandmother died rather than the second. I was in a different place at that first Thanksgiving. I was still in the stage where everything required more energy than I had and where the impulse to let things rest was very strong. I do not know with certainty that I would have acted on the information at the first Thanksgiving. I think the 2 years were part of what made it possible to act, not because the grief was gone, because the grief had settled enough to leave room for the other energy. Grief eventually makes room for things that require action when the action is warranted. It does not disappear. It becomes compatible with motion. I was compatible with motion on the Sunday evening when I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and typed my grandmother's name into the probate court portal. I was compatible with motion by then. I was ready to read what the record said, and I was ready to call a lawyer, and I was ready to do what needed doing. Grief had done what grief does, and it had left me standing and able. I believe my grandmother would have wanted exactly that. Stand up, read the ledger, find where the numbers went. I also want to say one thing about the people who helped without knowing they were helping. Patricia worked a sale and kept records and mentioned a number at dinner. Dennis had spent 27 years learning what estate documents look like when they have been produced rather than received. The probate court had built a public portal that a grieving person could access from a kitchen table on a Sunday. Judge Ayers asked the 3 questions that required documentation that did not exist. None of these people knew they were part of a chain. They were doing their work. They were keeping records. They were asking the right questions in the ordinary course of doing their jobs correctly. The chain formed around the ordinary careful work of ordinary careful people, and the chain was enough. My grandmother believed in the record. The record required a chain of people doing their work correctly to hold. It held. That is what I have to say about the people who helped. The chain of ordinary work holds when the people in it do their work carefully. I am grateful for every link. She kept a journal for the last 15 years of her life. Not every day, but regularly, several times a week. Small, hardbound notebooks with her handwriting in them, the specific, precise script of someone who had been a bookkeeper and who believed that words on a page should be as legible as numbers in a ledger. After the estate was resolved and the check had arrived, I spent a Saturday afternoon reading through the last 3 notebooks, the ones from the last 2 years of her life. In the third to last entry, written about 6 weeks before she died, she had written the following. I have been thinking about the ring again. It was Arthur's grandmother's first, and then his mother's, and then mine. It carries more people than the stone. I want Vera to have it when I go because she is the one who knows what things carry. I believe she will take care of what she receives. I read that entry 4 times. I read it slowly the way you read something that was written specifically for you by someone who is no longer available to know that you received it. I thought about the ring in a dealer's collection somewhere, being shown in a case in a different city, and I thought about what my grandmother wrote and what she believed and what she made sure was written down correctly in a will so that it would happen the way she intended. And then I thought about Patricia at a Thanksgiving dinner saying the ring was a very strong seller, sold in the first hour, and I thought about what my grandmother wrote. I believe she will take care of what she receives. I could not bring the ring back. But I could find the records and read them and sit at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening with a yellow legal pad and make the numbers say what they actually said. That is a kind of taking care, not the kind she imagined, the kind that was available. I believe she would have understood the distinction. She was a bookkeeper. She knew that the number on the ledger has to match the number in the account, and that when it does not, you do not accept the discrepancy. You find where it went. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the journal entries. After I had read the entry about the ring 4 times, I kept reading, not looking for anything. Just reading my grandmother's voice in the specific form it exists now, which is handwriting in hardbound notebooks in the precise script of a former bookkeeper. 3 entries before the ring entry, she had written something that I have also thought about many times. She wrote, I have been thinking about what I am leaving behind, and I believe I have been as careful as I know how to be. The accounts are in order. The document says what I intend. I have told the people who need to know what they need to know. Beyond that, I have to trust that things will go as they should. I am a person who has always believed in the record. The record will say what it says, and I believe that is enough. She was a bookkeeper. She believed in the record. She organized the record as carefully as she could with what she had available to her. She put things in writing. She had a proper will with specific language and specific names. She trusted that the record would hold. What she could not have anticipated was that the record would need defending, and that defending it would require someone with access to a different record. An estate sale professional's working files in a folder, in a file drawer, in a house 11 years of neighbor away. She could not have planned for Patricia. She could not have known that 2 years after her death, I would be sitting at a Thanksgiving table in my aunt's house, and that a woman named Patricia would mention the ring. She planned for what she could plan for, and she trusted the rest, and the rest required a specific chain of ordinary people doing their ordinary work carefully. Patricia keeping records. Dennis knowing what receipts look like when they have been produced rather than received. The probate court having a public portal that I sat at on a Sunday evening with a yellow legal pad. Judge Ayers asking the 3 questions that were exactly the right questions. The chain held. I believe my grandmother would have found this satisfying. She believed in the record, and the record held. It took 2 years and several people and a Thanksgiving dinner, but the record held. The ledger says what it says, and it says it correctly now.